In this lecture, we will continue our discussion of while loops. We'll start by taking a look at two more types of while loops. So the first one is going to be what we call a flag-controlled while loop. And the idea with this loop is we take some Boolean variable and use that as our loop control variable. So let me give you a format of such a while loop. So we can have something like this. Let's say we have a Boolean variable called found, and it's initially false. So our while loop would just say while found is still false, because here we say not found. So if it's initially false, let me do a better straight line. There we go. That looks better. So while found is false, so since not false is true, so this is still going to keep going until we change it to true. So while found is still false, we're going to do some stuff in our loop. And then we have this condition that we can check where whenever this condition happens, or at some point, we set found to true. And when found becomes true, then that means not found becomes false, so then we get out of our loop. So the point here is just we can use a Boolean variable for keeping track of how many times we run through the loop. And this type of variable, this found, we usually call it a flag variable. Here is a more complex example of using a flag. So what we're trying to do is we have a number guessing game where this first line is going to generate a random number between 0 and 100. So that's what this math.random method does. It technically does 0.0 to 1.0, but then we can multiply it by 100 to give us a random number between 0 and 100. So then our flag in this case is going to be done, and which is initially false. So while we're not done, we're going to have the user enter a guess. So that's what the console next int line does right here. And if our guess is correct, so if our guess equals the number that was generated, we output that's correct, and then we set done to true. Now, if this is not correct, then we want to tell the user that they're incorrect, but we can give them a little bit more information. We can tell them whether the number they guessed was too low or if it's too high, depending on what guess is. So if guess is less than num, then we would say that our guess was too low. Otherwise, we can say that it's too high. And then we just keep repeating this, so we'll keep saying whether the number is too low or too high until the user enters a guess that is equal to our random number. The last type of while loop we'll take a look at involves reading from a file, because the thing with it is we cannot rely on reading a specific data value. We can't use a sentinel for our files because we might be able to and say that our input ends when we read a specific number, but we really need a way of knowing when we're at the end of the file. So instead, we can use what's called the end of file, or EOF. This is a very special value, a very specific value that's used in files that lets a program know that we're at the end. So in Java, we can use a method that's called hasNext, and this also comes from the scanner class, and it will check to see if there's more data to be read. So let me give you an example. We can do something like infile.hasNext, where infile is the result of our file reader object. So this will return true if there's still data to be read. So it takes a look and see if there's still something in our file. And if there is nothing, if we're at the end of the file where we read this end of file value, then this method would return false. So here's an example where we read a file and compute the sum. Now in this case, I put the file reader part on another line just so I can fit it on the slide here. But this first line creates a scanner object called intFile, and that's going to create a new scanner object, but we use the file reader object, and we're going to assume that input.text is our input file. And then declare the sum and num as integers. So our while loop now just checks to see if there's still something to be read. So that's this line right here, the infile.hasNext. So as long as there's still something to read, we're then going to read that file using this line. We're going to take the value stored in num and add it to our sum. And then we just keep repeating this until infile.hasNext returns false, which means we're at the end of the file. And then we just simply print out the sum at the very bottom of our code.